The 10 objections. Objection number 7. I am a good person. I don't need religion. I'm a good person. I don't need religion is often cited as a basis for rejecting the claims of Christianity and rejecting it as a valid worldview. But am I a good person? What does it mean to be a good person? How do you measure that? What does good mean? At least I'm not an axe murderer. This will often be stated as a tongue-in-cheek idea of a moral comparison, but there is actually more truth here than there first appears on the surface. Here's the question. Why choose an axe murderer to compare ourselves against? That's a pretty loose standard. We don't have to aim very high to beat that standard. Have you ever noticed how we like to compare ourselves against others? That we will look at something that someone else has done wrong. That becomes our measuring stick. If we are gooder than most other people, do we become good? Why do we even feel guilt when we do something wrong? Why does it create such a negative emotional response in us? After the crime, why do we feel remorse? In fact, this is such a normal reaction that when someone does not feel guilt, we will label them as a psychopath or sociopath, someone who cannot relate to others in an emotionally healthy way. So how do we measure if we are good? Have you ever lied? Have you ever stolen? Have you ever hurt someone? Have you ever dishonored your parents in some way? If we answer yes to any of these, can we be justified in saying we are good? These standards are from the 10 Commandments, a moral standard and code for mankind that God has given us. Without that standard, all we do is reinvent our own standard, and now we are back to being better than the axe murderer. The axe murderer can do the same thing. He could say, at least I never killed more than one person. At least I'm not a serial killer. This is what happens when we don't have an absolute moral foundation. We will adopt any standard that suits our activities. But if that is a false standard, how does that benefit us? All we're doing is deceiving ourselves that we are good. Why do we desire to be seen as good? We are created to be pleasing to God, to be in His moral image. There is also in each of us the desire to be approved of by society, by those around us. We call it peer pressure. But as values become more and more subjective in society, as mankind seeks to define his own moral standard, the behavioural standards we adhere to become lower and lower. The desire for approval is healthy as long as it is tied to an absolute moral standard. If it is not, then it can become unhealthy. Good can then become good in the eyes of a gang, a violent gang. Good can then become good in the eyes of a group of drug users. Good can then become good in a society that attacks another society without cause. When we replace approval from God with approval from mankind, that is when society starts to break down. Judgment is also something we have a deep sense of. It drives the guilt and fear in us when we do something wrong. We have a natural fear of judgment, especially when we realize how high God's moral standard is. So now we have a problem. We know we're not good. We know that God will judge us based on the 10 Commandments. How do we escape that judgment? Do we become gooder and earn our way into God's good books? Is there even a way for us to escape judgment? When we understand the enormity of our selfishness and compare it to God's standard, we realize that the smallest flaw, the smallest treasured piece of selfish motivation is enough to warrant judgment and condemnation. So what can we do? In the Bible, it is explained to us that judgment does indeed have to come, that every sin has to be paid for, but that we have someone who was willing to take our place for that judgment, someone who was willing to step in and take that punishment for us so that we would not have to face it ourselves. This is at the core of Christianity, the message of Jesus Christ paying for our sins, so that we can be forgiven and restored into a relationship with God both in this life and in eternity. In Christianity, you're not trying to be good to earn God's favour. You are looking to Jesus Christ to grant you freedom from the sin and guilt and to give you goodness. When He died on the cross for you and for me, that is exactly what He did. He took our sins and exchanged it for His goodness. So instead of asking, am I good, or comparing ourselves to others, if we come to Jesus Christ and receive Him, we can be cleansed, restored, and set free from the condemnation we are so desperate to escape from. We can be made good as God originally intended us to be.